okay? So the literature on economic development and democracy since, Aristotle really, in some ways, but in the era of modern political science, certainly since Seymour Martin Lipset, has been recurrently trying to answer this question. Why do more prosperous, wealthier societies seem to have more democracy and a better chance of democracy? There are several possible classes of logical causal flows here. One is development leads to democracy. Countries get rich, they develop, then they become democratic. A second explanation could be that development enables democracy to persist once it emerges. This specifically is the argument of Przeworski and his colleagues. They argue there's no relationship in terms of democracies being more likely to emerge at higher levels of development, but if they emerge, they're more likely to survive and be stable. The third possibility, which isn't on here, is that development, it's a version of the first one. Development makes it more likely that democracies will emerge. So there's, both of these could be true. Przeworski argues only one of them is true, this one. The third argument is that liberal democracy leads to development. That if you have a democracy, and particularly a democracy with a rule of law, strong protection for property rights, and control of corruption, you're going to get more economic development. I mean, that kind of makes a certain amount of sense. On the other hand, there's a counter-argument here that, look at Asia. Which were the countries that developed very rapidly? It was, Korea under authoritarian rule, Taiwan under authoritarian rule, Singapore under authoritarian rule, more recently Malaysia under authoritarian rule. Now look at China has, lifted more people out of poverty in the last 30 years than has ever happened in human history, and it has had a more rapid economic growth rate than India. So there's the opposite argument that authoritarianism is more likely to deliver rapid development. And then the question, well, if it happens, then as happened in Korea, as happened in Taiwan, is democracy the inevitable result? Well, in Singapore, it hasn't been. Maybe it still will be. In Malaysia, it's looking like now this kind of is turning out to be true. In China, well, China's more authoritarian now as it's much richer than it was 20 years ago, than it was 20 years ago in the late 1990s. So, you can pick your argument and develop it as you wish. There's probably some evidence to sustain it. But I will say that because it is probably not what you're going to see in the remaining slides, the following things about the relationship between democracy or regime type as an independent variable in economic growth. Keep in mind, what we're trying to explain in this course is what enables the success of democracy, okay? With democracy is the dependent variable. We're not looking at what are the consequences of having a democracy. But with respect to this slide, I want to make the following generalizations, and then I need to move on. Number one, there appears to be no gross, powerful, consistent overall relationship between regime type and economic development. You can get rapid economic development and good development performance under both types of regimes. Number two, this is one of the most important conclusions and has been sustained by other research of a review essay that Adam Przeworski and one of his graduate students, Fernando Lamongi, wrote in the 1990s, I think it was, in the Journal of Economic Literature, reviewing all the literature on how different regimes perform in terms of economic development. And that is, there's a much wider range of variation in how authoritarian regimes perform economically than how democracies do. You do get the miracle performances in East Asia, but you also get the horrendous disasters and destruction of economic prosperity of authoritarian regimes like Zimbabwe, and now look at what's happening in Venezuela, where the regime really could write a textbook called How to Destroy a Country. So democracies are more like, the tortoise. They move a little bit more slowly than the hare, but they're going to get there in steadier fashion. The third thing is, if you look at just sub-Saharan Africa and see the work, for example, of an economist at Georgetown who used to be the chief economist for the U.S. Agency for International Development, Steve Radelet, R-A-D-E-L-E-T. His work has shown that the countries in sub-Saharan Africa in the post-Cold War period that on average have had the highest economic growth rates have been the democracies or near democracies of Africa. Now, of course, you got two exceptions, Rwanda and Ethiopia, but for the most part, the good development performers like Ghana have also been countries that have either had democracy or, like Kenya, at least a kind of semi-democratic system. And the fourth thing is the more recent economic literature, including by the Turkish economist at MIT, Daron Acemoglu, I think I said this before, shows actually a positive relationship over a long historical period between economic growth and democracy, yeah? Well, it's an argument that was expounded at greater length in a book by another book by Samuel Huntington called No Easy Choice. No Easy Choice. I think it's an argument that, if it was valid, was peculiar to a particular historical period. And you just look at the nature of industrialization now and of labor relations and so on, and the kind of world we're moving into. And it doesn't, I don't see recent evidence for it, but, I suppose if you want to engage in a close political economy or sociological analysis of what's happening to, a new realm of rapidly industrializing countries, you could potentially find some evidence for it. Yeah.
The second point, second explanation, is it not a natural extension of what we talked about, legitimacy reserves, that economic development gives legitimacy to democratic regimes and therefore enables them to persist once it emerges?
Yes. Yeah, that would be so. If it's the case that development gives democracy durability, then the question is why? And the answer is the reservoir of performance legitimacy. It would be the most important intervening variable. But then again, I invite you to ask yourself, what happens when this begins to crumble? Or when people lose faith in this or don't continue to experience at least gradual improvement in living standards after decades or even generations when they have assumed that would be happening. And so I was going to leave this to the end of the lecture. It's not clear I'm going to get to the end of the lecture, so I might as well mention it now. I believe we are entering, I fear that we are entering some uncharted territory, okay? The most obvious and powerful thing you can say about this relationship is, go back to either HDI or per capita income, either one, and look at those 45, 50 advanced industrial countries that, if you take out the artificially rich oil countries and set aside a couple of others, like Singapore in particular, all the others are liberal democracies. They were, until recently, in kind of, with respect to the concern of the course, boring liberal democracies. Boring in the sense of the question of the durability of liberal democracy wasn't really a question that people were asking. It wasn't an interesting question. Well, is Sweden or France or the United States or Japan or even now Korea going to still be a liberal democracy 20 years from now? We had reached a point where people were not asking that question anymore until recently. And now, the question is on the table in a way that it didn't used to be. And I want to get now, in a moment, to begin to unpack for you the Engelhardt and Weltzel article. But I'll just say that they have a kind of teleological dynamic. People internalize these liberal values, and then you have arrived at this reinforcing cycle of prosperity and democratic political culture, and it just keeps reinforcing itself. If the prosperity dimension goes away, can the culture survive without the prosperity? That's the interesting question. Here's the Przeworski data. He's looking at 40 years of every change in regime, to and from democracy. He's measuring income levels by constant 1985 purchasing power parity dollars. So all the per capita income levels from 1950 to 1990 are expressed in 1985 dollars. So he's got a constant level to compare with and using purchasing power parity. And it's very simple. The probability of a democracy dying among the lower income countries during this 40-year period was 12% in any given year. You had a 1.8 chance, an 8% chance of your democracy failing in any given year if you were below $1,000 in 1985 purchasing power parity dollars. As you go up the ladder, the probability, the failure rate declines. And when you get above $6,000 in purchasing 1985 purchasing power parity dollars, which is $12,000 today, if you adjust for inflation, then comes this favorite line that I like to quote from Przeworski and his colleagues. Once you get above $6,055, quote, democracy is impregnable and can be expected to live forever. Now, does anyone know whether we can falsify that statement? This was a statement written in the late 1990s based on his research 1950 to 1990. Based on that, he made not only an assessment, but a prediction. Any country that has a per capita income in purchasing power parity dollars of 12,000 or more in current dollars, 6,000 then, is impregnable. If they get to democracy, their democracy is impregnable. It can be expected to live forever. Now, there's at least one person here who should know the answer to the question I'm posing. Has there been any country since then that has falsified that generalization? It was right for the time. Hungary. Okay. I would argue Hungary is one. Thank you. Freedom House doesn't agree. I don't classify Hungary as a democracy anymore. I think it's an example of illiberal authoritarianism dragging a country below the minimum threshold of democracy.
Hungary doesn't have that income.
Huh?
Hungary's income is lower than that.
Actually, it's not.
It's not?
Not in purchasing power parity dollars.
I would speculate Turkey and
Yes, good. Thank you. You don't need to say anymore. These are non-Western countries that have, exceeded the high threshold. But these are the countries that have had, by my analysis, breakdowns of democracy that were above, 10,000 in purchasing power parity dollars, but in 2018, purchasing power parity dollars above even 12,000. And it tells us something, okay? It should tell us two things. Number one, as social scientists, we should be a little humble about predicting into the future. And number two, there may be different dynamics at play now in the contemporary period that are, at a minimum, raising the threshold of immunity against democratic failure well beyond the per capita income level that Przeworski identified. Maybe we'd now say, if you're above 26,000, you're immune and can be expected to live forever. But I mean, at some point it gets absurd, right? If you argue that Hungary's no longer a democracy, and it's in a gray zone, but I don't think it meets the test, and it's a pretty prosperous country that's a member of the European Union, does that mean, well, we don't count it because it's a former communist country? Or does it mean that, we should question our views about, for example, consolidation, that consolidation is a process that's irreversible, or that the West is special because it's been democratic so long?